All right, guys, so if you've been preaching very long, you've probably had problems with trying to preach from the Old Testament. So that's what we're going to talk about some today in Help Me Preach. All right, as I mentioned, if you've been preaching very long, you have probably noticed that a lot of your sermons are coming from the New Testament. And maybe even more specifically, they're coming from perhaps like the Pauline epistles, right? These big sections of narrative in the Gospels, you may not be doing very much other than maybe a few blurbs here every now and then. Or you maybe look at the Old Testament, you're saying, I'm not even doing much with the Old Testament at all. Maybe a few little blurs from Deuteronomy or something like that. What I want to try to do is to help you with some principles of preaching from the Old Testament. Now, there's a couple of things I just want to point out here before we get into this article that I want to discuss a little bit. The first thing is that when you look at the Old Testament, you need to ask the question, who is this about? And a lot of times we can go to the Old Testament and we can kind of preach it like a Jewish rabbi that would go through and look at this and say, here's moral lessons that should help you to be better. And there's value in that. There's definitely good things there. Or we may go through, and some people, I don't know that we would necessarily do this, but some people do. They try to make it an allegory of something that happens then that maybe has some kind of connection now. And while there are allegories, like in Galatians 4, we have to be very careful to make every single part of a story then means something else that we're ascribing meaning to. Okay, so those might be ways that you've preached from the Old Testament, but what I'd encourage you to think about is, what is the Bible about? What is the Old Testament about? And a lot of times we may think the Old Testament is about us. And while that's true, the Old Testament is about us in a sense, pointing out we're not cutting it. We're not making it, we're not righteous like we need to be. And so it's really trying to point to someone greater. See, the Old Testament is largely about Jesus. It's pointing us to Jesus. In fact, that's what Galatians 3 and verse 24 points out. And there's many other places we could go that bring this up. But what that means then is, in the Old Testament, what you'll have are a lot of pictures that are pointing to Jesus. And then you need to be trying to dig those things out. You need to try to find them. Now, another thing that's important is that you have pictures of the gospel as it's revealed in the New Testament. You have shadows of that in the Old Testament. And so, for example, like in the book of Galatians as well, he talks about how the gospel was preached to Abraham. Now, he's not talking about the overarching gospel of here's a death, burial, resurrection, and all those types of things. I don't believe that was what was taught to him, because he says, in your seed all the nations of the earth will be blessed. But what you have is a snapshot to then see there's times where God is warning or helping the people to see what he's ultimately going to do in Jesus. Okay, so with that being said, what you need to look at in the Old Testament are a couple of things. Is, how does this connect to Jesus? Then, how can I teach the good news, the gospel from this, or connect it to what we receive now? And then what are the lessons that I need to learn personally from this? And these are questions that you need to ask. So one thing that I think is helpful, though, is to look at the Old Testament and think about the pictures of Jesus and to see Jesus in the Old Testament. And so I'm going to put this article actually into the description. I'm not endorsing everything that he's saying, but I think he's got a lot of good things, because he points out some things like John 5 and verse 39, where Jesus said, you search the scriptures and they're the ones that testify about me. And you have many other times where Jesus points out, or he'll go to the Old Testament and say, hey, these are talking about me. And so these stories were ones that are pointing to Jesus. They're imagery that helps us to understand who Jesus is. And so what he does is he gives 6 broad categories in the Old Testament that you need to consider being Jesus. And the first one, I don't even know about the name of this. He calls it Christophanies. And basically, it's those times where in the Old Testament, you have the idea of the angel of the Lord. And there's times where it's like he's described as deity. He's worshipped all those types of things, which isn't really necessarily something that would happen like with an angel, for example. And so you may not believe that's Jesus. We could have a discussion about that. And what you can look at, though, is that this is at least some snapshot of who Jesus is or something Jesus would do or he's involved in. Now, this article, he's saying that he is the angel of the Lord. So if you're convicted on that, then so be it. Now, the other 5 are important, and some of these we use. The second is types. So, for example, you have types of prophets and priests and kings and prophets like Elijah and Elisha. Or you have David, he's a type of Jesus. Moses, he's a type of Jesus. And so those are times that you can look and see, here's Jesus in the Old Testament. Because not that Jesus is actually there, but that Jesus is the ultimate fulfillment of those people or those roles. They're shadows, he's the reality. Now another one, and this is one that I think we can often overlook, is the idea of analogous service. And so that means that, for example, you have an action that's done in the Old Testament, and Jesus does the same action in the New Testament, but he does it in fuller display. And so one example of this is the example of Job. Job goes through and he offers a sacrifice and appeals and mediates for his stupid friends. And what we see in Jesus is that he does that on an even greater scale. He offers a sacrifice on behalf of his friends that have forsaken him. And so, same type of movement and actions. And what you see is then here's how you can connect the story to Jesus and how you can show how great Jesus is. And then you can communicate the good news, obviously, of our salvation through him. All right, so the fourth one is something that we would think about all the time, is events that prophesy the coming of Jesus. For example, the Passover or the Day of Atonement. Those are times where you need to be looking and thinking, this is really about Jesus and is pointing to Jesus. And you need to make that connection. And so the shadow helps us to see the reality. The tutor is helping us to see the ultimate subject or lesson. And so those are important to consider. Now the fifth one is another one that perhaps we can overlook sometimes. It is the idea of titles that refer to Jesus. Now let me give you an example of this. The idea of Redeemer. Jesus is the great Redeemer. Now, the idea of redemption and redeemers is actually introduced under the Old Testament in the first 5 books of the Old Law. And then the idea of redemption is especially important in the book of Ruth. And so you may have heard that there are 3 redeemers in the book of Ruth. You have Boaz, you have Ruth, that the book is written about, and then the picture of God, or Jesus, being the ultimate redeemer. And so when you look at that, there's a lot of those. For example, the husband or the bridegroom, or whenever you see light or bread, or he's the water, all of those type of connections, you see them in the Old Testament. And Jesus in the New Testament makes connections to those. I'm the bread of life, right? John 4, he's the water that will quench thirst. That's a picture back to the Old Testament. And then one of the areas, again, this is one that we use all the time, number 6, is Old Testament prophecies about Jesus. So these are Isaiah 53, right? These are Psalm 22. These are Psalm 2, Psalm 110. All of those types of things. And so those have a meaning at the time, but they have a connection ultimately to Jesus. And here's the thing. I think the value in all of this is that you're starting to see the Bible as one cohesive story instead of a random collection of books. See, all of these different books are in the Bible for a particular reason. They're not just historical, just recording blanket history of the Jews, because there's a ton of history that's missing. They are selected particularly to guide us to Jesus. They're called persuasive narratives. That's what a lot of this is. And so while you do have law and you do have a lot of history in there and Psalms and all that kind of thing, ultimately we need to realize where they're going to. And that's the point of Galatians 3 as well. The tutor ultimately leads us to Jesus where we can have faith. And so I'm going to put that article down in the description. You can look at it for yourself. But it's one of those things that I think we do an injustice whenever we go through and we have these lessons about personal character and and how we can be benefited, and yet we don't make the connection ultimately to what God is doing through the rest of Scripture, and also particularly through Jesus. And so hopefully that was helpful. It's something that I'm really curious about and really thinking about lately. And so if you have any questions on that, feel free to shoot me a line or drop a comment. If you like this video, just click like, share it with your friends, and if you haven't already, subscribe. Just make sure you hit the bell, and we'll catch up with you later. Have a good one.